Hey folks, welcome back to Top Africa. This is Chris coming to you live once again from central Pennsylvania. Wherever you find yourself around the planet, whether it's here in North America or perhaps you find yourself somewhere in Africa, that'd be nice to see who's in Africa, or even Asia. You know, we have viewers in Nepal, South Korea, New Zealand, Australia, China even. So wherever you find yourself today, welcome. I hope that you've tuned in for what should be an interesting conversation. My guest, I'll do a brief introduction of him and then we'll get him on here. And we're going to be talking about a book project that he and I worked on that was sponsored by Stellenbosch University in South Africa. And I hope you find that interesting, talking about the origins and formations of the U.S. Africa Command. And let me just get to that in just a moment. But my guest today will be Ambassador Michael Battle, who is the former U.S. ambassador to the U.S. mission to the African Union, USAU. That's a place I served at, but unfortunately I didn't have the privilege of serving under Ambassador Battle. I served there later under Ambassador Brigady. I was a senior military advisor in that role, and that was my last tour in Africa as a foreign area officer in Africa, so it's one I'll remember. But Ambassador Michael Battle is a man of faith and was a chaplain in the reserve forces, if I recall correctly, and he served the U.S. mission to the African Union. So we're going to talk a little bit about his past, his experiences, and who knows, maybe even a little bit about lockdown, you never know. And then also specifically about the book, and this isn't to shield the book, folks. It's an academic book. If you want it, it's $160 on Amazon or at Walmart. You can get it or get the Kindle edition. But we're really here to talk about this topic of the U.S. Africa Command. And I haven't done that in a while. So anyway, let's get started, folks. Let me welcome in right now Ambassador Michael Battle. Sir, how are you today?
I'm doing extremely well, Chris. I wish our paths had crossed at USAU, but you served under my successor, who is an extremely wonderful guy and friend of mine, Ambassador Ruben Brigady.
Yeah, no, he's absolutely top drawer. It was a great experience. Navy veteran. He was in the Navy, went to the Naval Academy, did quite well there, and then went in academia after his time in the Navy. Was at George Mason for a while, and now I think is he an American now?
He was at Georgetown as a dean, and now he's president of a college, the University of the South.
That's the one. Okay, that's where he's at. Yeah, he's in demand. It's hard to keep up, keep up where he's going.
Yeah, we flip-flopped. I was president of an academic institution before becoming an ambassador, and he left the ambassadorial post and became president of an academic institution. So we had been operating in reverse.
Well, there you go. Well, I have to say this in the chat real quick. I'm going to mention this. One of the viewers in the chat has said that he said, Chris Wyatt, the clean-cut military look is much better than the hillbilly one. He's referring to your clean-cut and my apparent, but this isn't hillbilly. This is John Brown, the abolitionist look. That's what this is. In the tradition of my ancestors, 7 of my great-great-grandfathers fought in Union regiments. Of my 8 great-great-grandfathers, 7 fought in Union regiments from Maryland and West Virginia in the Civil War. So they probably would have liked John Brown. Maybe not so much. He was a rabble-rouser, but his intent was good, I think. I hope. Anyway, with that in mind, you are a man of faith, and you were a chaplain in the reserves. Am I correct?
Yes, I was a chaplain in the Army Reserve for 20 years. When I was in seminary at Duke, I had determined that I would go into the military as an active duty chaplain. Mm-hmm. But by the time I graduated from Duke and before my paperwork was finalized for the Army chaplaincy, I got a job offer as a university chaplain at Hampton University. And so that job and decided, well, I will do the reserve as my military obligation and serve as an academic chaplain as my paycheck obligation.
Well, that's a pretty awesome path to do. I have to say this. It's interesting for me because throughout my career, I'm not a person that goes frequently. I did it in my youth, of course, go to church frequently, but of course I have my faith and it's a matter of personal thing for me. But I always seem to gravitate towards the religious services and uniform in the field. When we were in the field and chaplains were out there, both for me, it was a sign of respect and support for the chaplain, what they're doing for our troops. But also it was kind of nice to have a service in the field when you're out on deployment or maneuver, something like that. So for me, having chaplains around was always a nice thing. I remember hearing people say, why are there chaplains in the military? I'm like, clearly you've never served in uniform.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You know, I used to tell people, because people will always ask me, they say, Chaplain Battle, why is it that your chapel services are always packed? Whether I was in the field or on post as in the chapel on post, whether in my reserve or when we were doing AT. And I would always say, my chapel services were packed because the troops saw me out in the field. When they did a 25-mile road march, I was out there. When they were crawling in the sand and in the dirt and in the dust and the mud, I was out there with them. When they were doing overnight bivouac, I was out there. So if you're with the troops, when the troops are doing what they do well, they will come to you on Sunday morning and worship in chapel. So I had packed chapels all the time because I was engaged with the troops outside of the chapel. And I always found that to be quite refreshing. And chaplains in the military, when they do their job well, you're not doing exclusively a religious job. You are working with young men and women who are wrestling with life issues, much of which are connected with faith, but a lot of which have no connection whatsoever with faith as a strict definition, but have to do with growing up, with becoming a person. And so chaplains served in that role. We were the only officers who had as much access to a basic trainee as we did to a commanding general. And you were able to move up and down the ladder without worrying about violating rank structure. That's what's so beautiful about being a military chaplain.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, Ambassador, because I think it's absolutely spot on. I think a lot of people don't realize, and I didn't really get to that point, but I mean, I just kind of left it open. You described it very well, is that, and I said someone that asked that question clearly hasn't served in uniform, because as you highlighted, you have a lot of young people come in. That's the majority of the troops in the Army, or in the military, I should say, and overwhelming percentage is young folks, and there's a maturation process there. They're still growing up. They're still becoming young men and young women. And, you like to have this tough exterior in uniform, whether you're a man or a woman. You want to prove your mettle in uniform. And nobody likes to give the appearance of weak. And so a lot of people are reticent to go talk to a counselor, a medical professional. But chaplains are there, and they're there for a purpose.
And, most people don't recognize also that an Army chaplain minimally has 7 years of higher education, 4 years of college and 3 years of seminary. And many of us have done pastoral education, pastoral counseling, courses in psychology. I did both civilian pastoral CPE, clinical pastoral education at Duke University Hospital, and also military CPE at Walter Reed Hospital. So the ability to counsel, the ability to be present, most of all, the ability to relate to people in the middle of struggle, that ministry of presence is what made it effective for me. And to be a university chaplain at the same time, I was dealing with young people who were deeply engaged in academic struggles. I taught philosophy. Logic and scientific method was my primary course at Hampton University. Mm-hmm. So dealing with academic issues that young people were dealing with, and also with the life issues that young soldiers were dealing with, gave me a more well-rounded life, I thought. So I got as much out of serving the men and women in uniform as they got from my presence.
Geez, I think we're going to have to invite you back and just have a conversation about chaplaincy. I mean,
okay, then let's talk about the book.
No. I'm just saying this. I want to keep going with this conversation. We're going to have to do that, but it's just before we get to the book and before that, I want to talk about the USAU and your because becoming an ambassador is a pretty awesome thing. It may be a frustrating thing at times in the job, but it's a pretty awesome thing to do it. But I did want to say is that, when I started this channel last year, one of the big reasons I did it, people asked me to go, because they watch my prepared videos, like, why don't you do live streams? And I started doing them, and people like, yeah, this is what people want. And I realized that, because I was focused on Africa, of course, it's Chris White Africa, although now I've branched into the U.S., which is a little more controversial, U.S. politics. And you and I wouldn't agree on some of that political stuff, but we're adults, so we don't worry about that. But I started doing it because I was honestly concerned in March of last year when South Africa declared a lockdown and people were basically prisoners in their homes, about people's mental health, their welfare, about gender-based violence, domestic violence, incest. Nobody ever talks about that. But predators have access to their children 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I mean, it's a really disgusting topic to talk about. But all of these social ills that would now be magnified by people being trapped in their homes and around each other. And in South Africa, a lot of people, millions living in informal structures. I mean, if you go back to your 1,800 square foot or 10,000 square foot mansion with electricity and air conditioning, that's one thing. But if you have to go to your tin shack or your government provided house, or you live in a farm or rural area, my concern was about people's social welfare and their mental health, and that's another reason why I've continued the streams. It's a lot of work doing 2 streams every day, but a lot of people constantly write to me and go, "Thanks a lot. We really appreciate your streams. The guests you bring are really fascinating. It gives us a chance to unwind and talk about something different. Even when you talk about politics, we find that entertaining." So for me, I'm obviously not a chaplain, and that's not my vocation or calling, but I appreciate the need for, I don't know, maybe is this the right phrase? Spiritual well-being?
Well, yeah, spiritual well-being, spiritual wholeness, just wholeness of a person, spiritual, psychological, mental, emotional, physical, the whole 9 yards, dealing with people. One can never isolate from a human their mental well-being from their physical well-being or from their spirit. We are whole entities. And so there's a sense in which all of us must be in some sense of harmony in order to succeed. You speak about the pandemic and the lockdown in South Africa and in many other parts of the African continent. I did a Zoom, about a month and a half ago with a group of African sociologists and counselors. And we were talking about the effect of the pandemic and what lockdown meant. And that when one is living in a structure, either in South Africa or in Ethiopia or any other part of the African continent, where you have families of people living in what is the size of an American living room,
Yes.
You cannot have 6 feet of separation.
No.
And if you live in a place where running water is not accessible as it is in the Western world, you cannot wash your hands 15 or 20 times a day because it's just not feasible. So what we were trying to look at is different modalities for people to remain healthy based upon their own existential circumstances. And one set of modality will not fit every situation. So there has to be a difference in modality. And that was a real meaningful conversation about how to adjust based upon what one's reality happens to be. But I'm hopeful. I got my first shot of the Pfizer vaccine, and I'm going to get the second shot sometime mid-February. I'm hopeful that with vaccinations happening here in the U.S. and also being made available around the world, that we will be able to put this pandemic behind us and manage it as we manage the annual flu shot or something like that. We cannot remain as social beings in total isolation for too long a period of time.
No, absolutely. Well, you had the vaccination, and just for my audience's confirmation, I don't see any third arms growing out
No,
of
no, four of my sisters are nurses, and one of them, one sister is the vice president of the University of Chicago health system. And after nursing, she did a master's in business administration. So I take my cue from the 4 nursing sisters of mine more than from anything and anybody else.
Well, there you go. That's pretty cool. Well, I almost had flashbacks there. You started talking about the modalities, the different circumstances, people, 8 or 10 people in one room, and obviously fetching water from a well or something like that. And it took me back to when I was in high school, living in a trailer and having 8, 10 people sleep in the same room and fetching water from a cistern and using an outhouse at -20 in the wintertime to go to the bathroom. Yeah, okay. We'll move on from that story, but so let's jump ahead for a little bit here. You were appointed by President Obama to become the ambassador to the African Union, U.S. mission to the African Union, yes?
Yes. Prior to being appointed as U.S. ambassador to the African Union, I had a very deep record in Africa engagement. Mm-hmm. I was the vice chairman of the board of the American Committee on Africa. And I had also served as an election observer when Nelson Mandela was elected as the first president of Free South Africa. Interestingly enough, I interviewed F.W. de Klerk on the day of the election. And he and I had a very good conversation. And I said to him, Mr. President, how do you feel about being challenged in this election? And his response to me was something that I admired from him. He said, look, my only interest is that I had announced that under my watch, we will have free and fair elections in South Africa. What we're doing now is we're having a free and fair election in South Africa. And he said, that is my only concern. And it was myself and some others who were in conversation with him. And then I met him again at the African Union when he was engaged in something with Mbeki. And I reminded him of that conversation. So, yeah, I'd also led a number of study tours on the African continent with theologians who were doing studies of Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, and also doing analysis of some of the indigenous religions on the African continent. So when Barack Obama asked if I would serve as an ambassador, and my response was, I would be happy to do it, but I want to serve somewhere that the work is going to be hard, it's going to be meaningful, and it's going to be relevant to the overall issues that the administration wants to carry. And they said, well, it'll take about 3 or 4 weeks before we decide where we want to assign you. But the very next day they said, okay, we want you to go to the African Union. And I said, okay, let's roll. And that's how I ended up in Addis Ababa for 4 years. The longest serving U.S. ambassador to the AU in history at this point.
Yeah, I remember. I was beginning to wonder if anyone else is allowed to have that job. You're doing so well there. Of course, when you were in Addis, I was all over the continent. I moved a couple of times in that time frame. But yeah, so if I can just very quickly just ask about that, what was that experience like for you? I mean, relatively speaking, it was relatively new, the AU, because the OAU had not gone away too long before that. And the U.S. was the first country to give diplomatic recognition to the African Union and establish relations with the African Union. So what was that like for you? And you weren't the first, were you? I mean, was Cindy Corva there?
No, I wasn't.
Cindy Corva was there before you.
I was first.
Yeah, yes. She was there before you, so you were the second.
Right. She served for about a little less than 2 years, I think.
Yeah, I think
but what it was like, when I first went to USAU, the U.S. government was still questioning the viability of the mission, whether or not it was sustainable. And my function was to either build it where it would be sustainable or help recognize that it was not going to be a sustainable exercise. I've always taken the point of view that if you're given an opportunity to build and make something significant, then you do so. And so I wanted to formalize the relationship between the United States and the African Union, because prior to then, it had only been sort of a loose relationship. No formal documents had been signed. So we were able to construct, with the African Union's engagement and with a whole of government engagement in the U.S., a memorandum of understanding between the U.S. and the African Union, which then gave coverage for what we were doing militarily, socially, even with the now African Union CDC. I was engaged in those initial conversations with the US CDC about how to help the African continent develop a Centers for Disease Control. So we did a whole lot of things, structured it, made it formal, and the mission grew. And in my second year at USAU, the United States decided it was time to re-engage with the UNECA, the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. So my portfolio was expanded to include being U.S. ambassador to the African Union and U.S. permanent rep to the UNECA. And in my third year at Addis, I became co-chair of the AUPG, the African Union Partners Group. So because I was co-chair of the African Union Partners Group, all of the non-African nations that supported the African Union, and a representative to UNECA and ambassador to the AU, I got to work with all of the multilateral organizations, to include the African Development Bank. And the African Development Bank work happened because of my AUPG role. So by the time I left USAU, Johnny Carson, who was the Assistant Secretary of State, said to me that no one questions the viability of USAU anymore. And I took that as been a major a sense of the accomplishment that we were allowed to do working with a good staff. The staff was built up. We did a whole lot of excellent things. We had great relationships with the AU Commission, as well as with a number of the presidents on the African continent. I got to meet and engage with a number of the presidents on the African continent, as well as the African Union Commission.
Well, yeah, I'd have to agree with the assessment that Johnny Carson, Ambassador Carson, said there about no one questioned the viability. I mean, I do remember that time frame, and people when Bush created the mission, like, what's
Right.
what? I mean, what? I mean, what? People were actually saying it in that fashion. I mean, even less articulately than I just did. And,
Right.
And we obviously could see the utility and I think arguably the need for a mission at the African Union. The one I guess a lot of people probably didn't see, including the previous administration and then the Obama administration recognized later on, was that the need to have your position also be accredited for the United Nations Economic Commission there, because a lot of people don't even know that it's located in Addis Ababa, if they even know it exists.
Yeah. You know, and because of that, but first of all, let me give credit to George W. Bush, which I do in the article that I did in the book. And I did that intentionally because George W. Bush had a vision of the value of multilateral diplomacy that no other president prior to him had been able to see vis-a-vis the African continent. So George Bush, Condoleezza Rice, and Jedidiah Frazier, who at that time was the Assistant Secretary for Africa, a Republican administration with a keen understanding of the necessity to work collaboratively with African nations. And interestingly enough, Bush's orientation was never a paternalistic orientation. Bush saw Africa as strategically as well as tactically important. And he wanted to build relationships because he saw Africa to be important. Important not only to the US, but important to itself. And because Africa was important to itself, it was important to the global community. So he took significant risk in starting USAU. And I was really pleased that President Obama saw the wisdom of what Bush did. And I think one of the reasons that the Bushes and the Obamas are personally close as they are, and, you know, people talk about the relationship between Michelle Obama and George W. Bush and about the fact that they have a genuine closeness. It is an authentic closeness. And part of that authentic closeness developed because of their seeing a common vision for the African continent, as well as a common vision for the U.S. engagement in a constructive way in the global community. One of the things that I said in the article, but was taken out of the article and put in the footnotes, was that George Bush benefited from having a president follow him who saw the need for continuity and who saw the need to work collaboratively on a vision that was already in place. Unfortunately, and this has nothing to do with one's politics, but unfortunately, Donald Trump did not see that same need for continuity and connectivity between what previous presidents had done. Had he done so, he would have been able to see that there had been a consistent bipartisan, as many Republicans as Democrats, as many Democrats as Republicans supported the need to work collaboratively with Africa. One of the things that amazed me most, Johnny Isaacson, a white Republican from Georgia, who was a friend of mine prior to my becoming an ambassador because he was in charge of educational development in the state of Georgia because of his senatorial seat, and I was president of an academic institution in Georgia. So I had a good relationship with Johnny Isaacson. But Johnny Isaacson, a white male Republican from Georgia, and Karen Bass, an African-American woman congressperson from California, both were together in Addis Ababa working collaboratively on plans for the development of the African continent. So my praise of Bush It's not because he was a Republican. My praise of Obama is not because he was a Democrat, but because both of them saw the need for U.S. engagement with the African continent.
One of my viewers has asked a question, USAU. What that is United States mission to the African Union. That's the acronym we use for our diplomatic mission in Addis Ababa that represents U.S. strategic interests, well, all U.S. interests with the African Union. So that's just for one of the viewers there, so I understand that. Yeah, I think they thought they were confused by it. But so that is. Well, you mentioned something there about the wisdom of creating things. When Bush created Africa Command, there was, of course, we're going to get to that when we're talking about the book in just a second. There was a lot of consternation about it. He's undermining African sovereignty. They're going to take over Africa, and it's all about military bases. It's about, oil and resources. And it's interesting because there was a lot of programs that Bush came up with that still continue to this day that were rather groundbreaking, whether you like Bush or dislike him. I'm not, in full disclosure, not a major fan of George Bush, one way or the other, but the programs he did in Africa, the President's Emergency Program for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, which is a global program, but most of the benefit is accrued to Africa, the Millennium Challenge account, and so many other things. It took a while, but finally intervening in Liberia after people dumped bodies in front of Wellington apartments, but we finally got engaged there. And a number of other accomplishments around the country. Bush really, you've been all over the continent. Whenever I go place in Africa, people that know what's happening in Africa, some people revere George Bush in Africa. A lot of people they deeply respect him for what he did in Africa, and I would argue that he's done more vis-a-vis Africans than any president, including Obama, in our history. That's a personal view, and again, I'm not a big fan of George Bush. I think I'm trying to be objective.
Right. Well, I am a Democrat. I'm also a fan of George W. Bush because of his Africa policy. And there were some things that George W. Bush did that I significantly disagree with. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there were a number of things that George W. Bush did that were significantly important. I had the opportunity of meeting his father when he spoke at Hampton University, and I was the university chaplain there. I also met his father when a close friend of mine, Congressman Herb Bateman, back a long time ago, was the congressman of the 1st Congressional District in Virginia, a Republican congressman who was a good personal friend. I was invited to do the invocation for a program that Ronald Reagan was to come and speak, but Ronald Reagan could not come, and George H.W. Bush came. So I've met him on those two occasions. But, Clinton, Bush, and Obama had very proactive Africa programs. Mm-hmm. Clinton was the first president to assemble all of the foreign ministers on the African continent for a structured meeting. Bush, his record is just unmatched in terms of what he did on the African continent, which is why he's so revered. Obama was the first president to bring together all of the African heads of state and to start the U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit. And Michelle Obama and Laura Bush worked hand in glove on the First Lady's part of the African Leaders Summit. And their relationship continues to this day. So we've had great opportunity. Now, just to go back a little bit further, sure. Ronald Reagan did something on the African continent that unfortunately goes unnoticed. Reagan intentionally appointed the first person of color as U.S. ambassador to South Africa. Mm-hmm. And he did it because he knew it would shake South Africa up. While Reagan was talking about this non-engagement and non-interference,
constructive engagement,
he was making a bold statement by putting not only a person of color, but a person of color who was observably and noticeably a person of color as the U.S. ambassador to South Africa, which really shook things up. And Nelson Mandela often talked about how important it was that Ronald Reagan made that move. So we have had a history of presidents who have been engaged positively on the African continent, and a tremendous history of congresspeople and senators being engaged on the African continent. And we need to go back to that. for Africa's sake, for the global community's sake, and for the U.S. sake.
Well, I definitely, one thing I cannot disagree with there is that we certainly have a reasonably high level of congressional engagement in the continent, because I've had to deal with one congressional delegation after another working
Yes, yeah.
working in 8 different embassies in Africa. It's always a joy to deal with those, and you know what I'm talking about there. We won't share that with the audience.
Absolutely.
They're important, but they can be quite painful just preparing for them and making them happen. Folks, you're listening to Chris Wyatt Africa here on the Indaba Africa channel, part of the Indaba Broadcasting Network, on Thursday, the 4th of February, 2021. Can you imagine that, folks? It's been 15 months since Wuhan broke out in China. And here we are now, over a year since Trump first started the travel ban, January 31st last year. And we're still dealing with this pandemic. But today we're talking not about that. Specifically, we're talking about this new book that's just come out that Ambassador Michael Battle and my guests and I were involved in. Now, before I ask you, I'm going to share this with you so I can get your thoughts. But now the book we're talking about, this is from Stellenbosch University. It was printed by Routledge Press. And the title is Expanding U.S. Military Command in Africa, Elites, Networks, and Grand Strategy. Now, I received an email when I was the Director of African Studies at the Army War College. And it said, hey, we'd like you to participate in this book project on U.S. Africa Command. Would you be interested in that? And I was busy, as you can imagine, 3 different sheets of the way. But I mean, you know, it's humbling and nice to be asked to participate in an academic project like this. And so I just finished another book project with U.S. War College when this one came along. And I was curious. I looked at the list of authors, and I don't think I saw your name on there yet. There was like almost no Americans involved. And they're going to write a book about the U.S. military and Africa Command, U.S. government. And not that people would be skewed, but I thought it was important to have views from inside the wire, so to speak, and from outside the wire. So I didn't agree to it. I asked a couple questions, and about 3 weeks later, I got an email saying, congratulations, we're excited. All of you volunteered to be part of this book project. I'm like, wait a second, I didn't volunteer. I just asked a question. I wanted to know a little bit more. But then when I saw your name was affiliated with, I'm like, okay, good. We've got some inside the wire from a military and, in your case, military and diplomatic, but from military and diplomatic perspective, and I felt good about that. So how did you get involved in the project?
Well, when I left Washington, I went to Cincinnati, and I was the executive vice president and provost of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center, dealing with issues of freedom, both in the U.S. and worldwide, and combating slavery, modern day slavery, and dealing with the story of historical slavery. So when I first got an invitation to participate in the book, I turned it down because I was doing other things at that point. And then when I left the Freedom Center and decided to retire in January of 2017, I looked at it a second time, and they were saying, well, we need to really have somebody from the U.S. And I had either I recommended or somehow Reuben Brigady's name came up. And so Reuben was at that time a dean doing issues in foreign studies. So I figured he would be the logical person to do it. And for whatever reason, Reuben was not able to do the chapter. And so they came back to me and said, okay, would you please do this? And I said, well, if I do it, I'm going to talk about multilateral diplomacy. I'm going to talk about the favorability of what my impression of AFRICOM is on the African continent. And they agreed to that. So I said, let's lock and load and get it done. And so I was happy to do it. And particularly now that I have a copy of the book and I've read through the book. And your chapter and my chapter, I think, we try to balance multiple chapters that have a different point of view. And I think we successfully balanced it. Your conversations about the history and origins of what was going on when AFRICOM was being formed, and about some of the things that may have been able to be done a little bit better than it was. And what I was trying to do was to show that AFRICOM had a role and responsibility that was beyond what people normally classify as military. It's more than guns and bullets. AFRICOM was engaged in trying to train African militaries on how to be professional militaries, which means how to deal with things like floods and famines and national catastrophes, how to get aid and relief out to people, how to communicate well. One of the things that we did when I was at USAU with General Farrell, General Farrell was helping us, and General Farrell at that time was a 1-star stationed at AFRICOM, who later became a 3-star prior to retiring, helped to put together a communication system that allowed African militaries to communicate with each other across boundaries. That had never happened before.
Yep.
So we were able to do some really, really good things for the African continent. You mentioned earlier how some people thought, well, AFRICOM was going to come in only because the U.S. was interested in oil and other things. Well, we were interested in oil. We were interested in how to allow Africans to protect from the theft of oil off the coast of Africa. So we were able to put together with the African Union a structured maritime strategy. Now, I'm hoping that the U.S. can return to working with the African continent on developing a maritime strategy that will allow African nations to protect their coastlines, not only from the theft of fish from off the coast of Africa, but from the theft of oil off the coast of Africa, and also to prevent the drug trafficking that, I mean, you take a little nation like Guinea-Bissau, at one point was completely overrun by the monstrous drug traffickers. Guinea-Bissau had 2 or 3 little boats in its entire arsenal, and most of them did not even work. Yep. But drug traffickers had planes, boats, and money, and all that kind of stuff. So Guinea-Bissau had a hard time defending itself and protecting its interests. AFRICOM is able to help nations like Guinea-Bissau strengthen its capacity, working not only collaboratively with the African Union, but working collaboratively with the African Union partners as well. Otherwise, China is going to build a maritime strategy with the African continent, and other nations will do so. I think it's better if we do it than it is with other nations doing it.
No, absolutely agree. So you've got your copy of the book. I haven't gotten mine. It said respond by December 7th. I haven't got it.
I bought it. You know, I'm still waiting on my free copy.
Oh, okay. I'm waiting my free copy. I was about ready to
put down $160 and purchased my copy of the book.
Oh, look at that.
And read the book. And when you read all of the chapters, Chris, you will be tremendously grateful that you wrote a chapter in this book.
Well, that was my hope.
Yeah. Your hope was fulfilled because I'm glad that the editors accepted our balancing of the rest of the book. Not that the rest of the book is bad, because it's not. It's a good book. It's an excellent academic piece on strategic studies. And I encourage everybody to read it. But it would have been a horrible academic piece had it not had your chapter and my chapter. And I'm not saying that in a braggadocious way. I'm saying that in a way that is reflective of truth.
No, I absolutely believe you. I mean, as I was being fully honest there, my concern was, and not looking at any of the particular authors, that wasn't a concern, but the fact that there were no Americans involved in the project when I was asking involved. I'm like, I mean, if I was going to write a book about South Africa and it was a collaborative effort, I wouldn't take, Nepalese, Americans, Argentinians, and no South Africans. I mean, come on. I mean, whether you're on the right or left or in the middle, you have to have some South African expert because there is expertise there. So, yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that it balanced out that way. It's interesting. Before we talk more about the book, there's a few things just come up that you talked about. When we talk about U.S. Africa Command, when it started up, a lot of people. I mean, the whole argument was, and you read my chapter there, that, well, it's all about counterterrorism. Well, it wasn't about counterterrorism. In fact, when Africa Command first got its sea legs under it, no pun intended there, but when it got its sea legs under it, that was almost no focus whatsoever for the command, not even for Special Operations Command. They weren't even focused on that. And I remember very specifically a program that from the outset, I was in Liberia when the command became active. It was a sub-unified command, and I was rebuilding the Armed Forces Library. And then it took over the Security Cooperation Offices in May 1st of 2008. And one of the first programs they started pushing to us right away, which European Command was not doing, and this is because Eric Threet was there. He was a naval officer, a commander there, or lieutenant commander at Africa Command. He was given a pot of money and told forth, go forth and do great things, but he had some guidance. And they worked on this pandemic response program. And the idea was to help African governments, not just the military, but African governments develop plans and the capacity on how to deal with pandemics. This was in 2007. They came up with this idea. 2008, we put in place. When the Mono River region Ebola outbreak took place in December 2013, it was reported by Médecins Sans Frontières and a few others, and the world ignored it until August of 2013 or 2014. That's when the world started paying attention. What happened was that the Nigerians had a few people come back from Liberia and that region who came in with it, and the Nigerian health services acted instantly. And they did immediate contact tracing. They isolated, quarantined those people. Now, they deserve all the credit in the world, in my view. And I've been praising the Nigerian public health system for that response because I thought they did a bang-up job when other people were saying that U.S. Army did a great job. And, well, we did some useful things, but Africans really solved the problem, in my view, in the Mono River region. But anyway, so I've been praising the Nigerians endlessly about that. And the thing is that to be fair, it wasn't entirely unselfish because from my perspective, part of the reason they were able to respond in that fashion is that they embraced the concept of the pandemic response program that U.S. Africa Command put out there, and they participated in it. And it paid dividends just a few short years later. That's one example of things that are something that the military forces could deliver that someone else's couldn't do, and it wasn't taking over people's sovereignty. We didn't even tell them what to do. They could use it or not. And there are a lot of programs like that. Africa Endeavor, which was, as you talk about, getting African militaries to work together regionally and continentally, which was never done in the past. The OAU never did it. The African Union never did it. We did that. No, the European Union didn't do it. Now, others have done similar things since then, but the U.S. Africa Command is what really got it started.
Yeah, it really did. You know, I had the opportunity of working very closely with General Ward and very closely with General Ham. And the General Rodriguez, I think, was the third general. I was there when he was installed, but I did not work closely with him because I left. But General Ham and General Ward would often come to Addis, and I would have consultation with them. And they would ask me my opinion about how AFRICOM can work most effectively on the continent. And I would always remind them that the military does more for people in a nation when people see the military as a part of the people, a part of the nation that can work collaboratively to do good. And doing good has a lot to do with pandemic responses, responding to floods, responding to famine, getting aid out to remote areas, helping communication from remote villages to capital cities, building transportation systems, teaching people how to repair Jeeps and trucks and cars, teaching people how to put together electrical grids. All of these things that the Army Corps of Engineers has been doing for ages. African nations can learn tremendously from that. And that's really what AFRICOM was able to do. And, you know, people have the impression that the U.S. had no military interest or coverage of Africa prior to AFRICOM. That wasn't the case. It had coverage. It was just scattered coverage. What AFRICOM simply sought to do, as you pointed out exceedingly well in your chapter, was simply to bring together under one umbrella a structured way of relating to the African continent. And now, you know, when you talk to people at the African Union, they have a great appreciation for what AFRICOM has been able to do. I'm hopeful that at some point, the Rapid Response Unit that we had talked about trying to develop at the AU would come to reality, because the African Union has what is called a non-indifference approach to intervention. The United Nations, on the other hand, non-indifference, the African Union. The United Nations has a non-interference policy. Now, the way they differ is this. The United Nations cannot get involved if there is an extra constitutional coup, a military coup or something like that, unless invited, because it is non-interfering.
Right.
The African Union has a non-indifference policy, which means that the African Union, by law, must get involved if there is a coup or some other kind of devastating thing that happens in an African nation. But what the African Union does not have is the capacity to get engaged. So what a rapid response unit will be able to do would be able to allow the African Union to match its capacity with its responsibility.
Absolutely. I was going to say here that when the command was stood up, when it was announced, and I was in Africa, and then people were approaching me all the time, and I go to conferences and talk to Africans all over the continent. Yeah, well, who's the United States to have a command for Africa? Who do you think you are? Like, well, listen, whether we like it or not, our military has global responsibilities. When there's a tsunami in Indonesia, the Navy, the 7th Fleet responds from Pacific Command, now Indo-Pacific Command. When there's an earthquake, somewhere else, we do this. When there's a war somewhere, we're engaged. When there's, we don't have a choice. Just that's the geostrategic realities. And I said, in fact, instead of taking offense to Africa Command, I think that Africans ought to feel complimented that the U.S. Department of Defense is now saying that Africa matters. It's a place that's important. It matters geostrategically, and it should get the respect that it needs. And therefore, we'll have a single 4-star general who goes to Congress every year and justifies a budget to work with our friends, partners, and allies in Africa for the betterment of Africans and in our geostrategic interests. Instead of dividing amongst 3 commands that were disjointed, and you had seams and gaps there, now you have one commander responsible for U.S. military actions under a diplomatic envelope in Africa. Right. And I said, I think Africans should feel complimented by that. And people are like, well, yeah, well, nobody does. I'm like, well, look, South Africans look at Africa and they look at it in different ways. We don't tell you how to suck eggs. And when people are like, well, what if Africans don't approve? I'm like, well, who cares? I said that in a cheeky way. I'm like, who cares whether Africans approve? This is an administrative reorganization within the Department of Defense. It doesn't mean any change in policy necessarily. It can lead to change, and it did, but it doesn't mean that policy is going to change. We were involved in Africa supplying arms to Zaire and Mobutu for decades. We were involved in supporting Ethiopia militarily, and then when they had the revolution, became a Soviet client, we switched over to Somalia. We've been involved. We had Liberian military base back in the Second World War. We've been in Africa. We trained the frontier force in Liberia. Several successive African-American Army officers went there to do that. So we've been involved in the African military for a long, long time. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
And people don't recognize it sometimes, but Ethiopia has supported the U.S. military in some of its interventions as well. Yeah. And so peace and security on the African continent is a factor of American concern because it is a factor of global concern. I think now if you have a conversation with most African leaders, they see the benefit of the U.S. Africa Command because they see the benefit of U.S. engagement on the African continent. Academics, and I'm an academic by background, having taught philosophy and religion at university level and having been president of a theological seminary, I know how academics think, and it's important for academics to be critical in a substantive manner. But it's also important for academics to be practical, where academics have to look at the practical realities as well as the structured theoretical realities in terms of its analysis of anything, to include AFRICOM. The average president on the African continent, the average person on the African continent, when they see the benefits, as they have seen, of the presence of U.S. engagement, not isolated from U.S. AFRICOM engagement, but U.S. engagement as a whole, they are tremendously pleased that the U.S. is present. And part of the U.S. presence is AFRICOM.
No, absolutely, and so for me, writing the chapter was, in some respects, kind of a labor of love. I mean, I was with Africa Command. I mean, technically, since Vice Admiral Mueller was appointed to build the transition team, and I was back at the Defense Intelligence Agency working at the Pentagon and briefing him and his small team about Africa, which they didn't know much at all about Africa, on a frequent basis. And then I went to Liberia, and then the command was stood up. And so I spent all the time, basically from 2007 until 2015, nearly a decade, in one form or another, either in Stuttgart for one tour or somewhere in the continent under Africa Command. And for me, those particular tours, none of those were attaché tours. They were all security assistants, because I kept getting drawn into that whole. I guess they liked what I was doing, or they couldn't find somewhere else to put me, whichever the case was. So I was actually part of Africa Command from the very outset until that time frame. And so my experience has been over multiple commanders. You mentioned all three of them there. General Ward, whom I thought was the right guy at the right time in the right place for that job. That was my view on it. And then we had General Ham, who was a good transition. And then General Rodriguez was a very different kind of character, but I enjoyed working under him as well. It was a tremendous experience. But from your perspective, the book itself, was there any part? Well, I should say, you mentioned the editors. I would have to tip my cap to these guys. As you said, they gave us great latitude, and they didn't try to force us to change our content, whether they agree with something or not. They did have questions about clarification, but these were specific things that I explained. Unfortunately, a couple things had gotten out in the public, and people had thought that that's the way things were, but the public was mistaken. And so I had to clarify that. So I just clarified a few times, and it made sense to them. But from your perspective, what was the most enjoyable part about writing this chapter, or did it just flow from your mind right away and your keyboard, or did it something you had to really think hard about?
No, well, I thought hard about it because I was trying to do three things in the chapter. One, I was trying to chronicle my 4 years at USAU. Two, I was trying to justify the value of multilateral diplomacy as a logical augmentation of structured bilateral diplomacy, and trying to show that there is no disharmony between bilateral diplomacy and multilateral diplomacy. And then thirdly, I was trying to show how AFRICOM fit as a part of larger U.S. engagement, whole of government U.S. engagement on the African continent. So when you read my chapter, there is as much about multilateral diplomacy as there is about AFRICOM, and there is as much about chronicling the relationship between the U.S. and the African Union, and also the U.S. and the UNECA, and briefly about my role at AUPG. So I was trying to do those three things: chronicle the 4 years, advance the notion that multilateral diplomacy is a significant augmentation to bilateral diplomacy, and to see AFRICOM as a part of a whole of government structured approach to the African continent. And they gave me the latitude to do that. In fact, they did push back once or twice, wanting me to do more on AFRICOM exclusive. And I said, no, I need to talk about multilateral diplomacy because AFRICOM fits into the picture as a part of a multilateral approach. So I resisted, and they accepted my resistance. They did ask me to mention more people. So then I went back and I talked specifically about the role that Jedediah Frazier, Condoleezza Rice, George W. Bush played, the role that Secretary Clinton, Secretary Kerry, and Assistant Secretary Johnny Carson played in the whole of government approach to the African continent. So I was really pleased that they accepted the chapter as I presented it.
No, that's awesome. And, I have to say that the whole world's been affected by the Ebola situation, or not Ebola, sorry,
Yeah.
the COVID-19 situation. Sorry.
COVID-19.
Yeah, sorry. Fading back to previous days, Ebola. But so even we were. I mean, this thing was supposed to be published a year ago, and at least that's originally told. So I was all excited about that. And I was also, it was going to be published before I retired, and I was kind of excited about that because I didn't have the RET on there after Colonel on there. So now it's Colonel retired. But we had to wait because some of our co-authors were in Italy. I think one or two of them, and they couldn't complete the project with all the chaos going on in Italy this time last year. So it's finally there. It's finally published. And now I'm going to have to break down and order the thing. And while I wait for my free copy, just so I can read the whole book. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, I got tired of waiting on my free copy. And, I had shared with some of my academic friends at different universities that it was coming out. And I wanted to make sure that I read the book in its totality. I co-chaired the Biden campaign's Africa policy team. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to also make sure that the book as a whole did not end up being something that would have been overly controversial. That's one of the reasons I wanted to read the whole thing. So I broke down and paid the $160 and ordered it. And I'm glad I did.
Now, I think that I'm going to have to do the same sort of thing because I've been dying to read everyone else's chapter. I'm not worried about what your chapter says, but I'm a little apprehensive about what I'm reading some of the other ones. So I'm going to have to break down and get it myself. But yeah, no, it's nice to see it come to fruition. Now, this is something I got to ask. In my previous effort, in a collaborative effort like this, where I was publishing a book, my editors chose my chapter title. I didn't get it. So they came up with for my chapter in that book, a very unsexy, very esoteric looking chapter. Now I just not to put you on the spot, but your chapter, so people know, it's multilateral diplomacy in the formation of the U.S. Africa Command, reflections on U.S. Africa policy and engagement from Bush through Obama, 2016. That's a great title, but that's a long title. Was that your title, or did the editors come up with that?
That was my title because I insisted on that title because I wanted to cover the three things.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's there. It says it.
I would not have covered it.
Yeah.
I wanted to cover multilateral diplomacy, and you could not cover multilateral diplomacy on the African continent without talking about George Bush because of his positive role in that. Yep. And you could not talk about the collaborative of my experience at USAU without being able to put it in some kind of context. And you notice the AFRICOM part of it was stuck in there as well. I wanted to do three things. And, I've published a lot of times before. Mm-hmm. And so I know what it's like to make sure that you argue to get your title the way you want your title, because your title is descriptive should be descriptive of what you plan to say. It's like choosing a dissertation topic. You choose your own dissertation topic. Your committee doesn't do that. And I was not going to let anybody choose the topic. So I chose the topic. It's a long topic, and I know it was long, but it had to be long in order to cover what I wanted to cover.
No, it was very descriptive. That's why I was curious. But so you have chapter 3. I have chapter 4. Mine is the genesis and origins of U.S. Africa Command. Now, I will say this. They did entice me by telling me that I had the lead chapter in this book, and most important one. Then I saw them come up. Wait a second, Ambassador Battle came before me. That sounds like false advertising. I want my money back. But no, I happily concede because in order to get that, well, actually, our chapters could come in either order, but both, I think the way it's done is the right structure.
Now, let me ask you a question, Chris.
Yeah.
Did you do all of they have a lot of footnotes behind your chapter. Mm-hmm. There are 74 footnotes.
Yes.
And I noticed that with my chapter, there were a lot of footnotes that I had not put in, but I'm glad that they did. It's an academic responsibility to do careful footnoting. So they took some of the things that I said, and then their research team went back and found documentation that validated what I had already said.
Mm-hmm.
So you have 74 footnotes on your chapter.
I have to go back and look at how many I have. I mean, I don't recall if it was 74, but it was certainly a fair number of footnotes. Now, a number of mine are from interviews, so I'm citing
Right.
interviews. But there's also published source in there too. Yeah, no,
Right.
I made an effort to. The problem I had is, well, not the problem, but the thing is that a lot of the stuff that I refer to, there were the ways to cite it, but unfortunately, a lot of it was not a lot, but some of it was internet-based stuff because it was newspaper articles that were written in opinion pieces or statements that were published in newspapers because there was no academic work done at that time, virtually none. So, because when I start with the origins, now when it comes to the assessment of what is Africa Command, what did we get, what is this car now that it's a decade old plus, there's those footnotes are more recent and cite some academic articles and feedback there. But the natural thing was that the early part of this involved a lot of interviews, like Teresa Whalen and other officials involved in this. And so those interviews are the early parts of the footnotes, plus some press releases and some media things. And then later you get into more academic and published books because then it's kind of it covers a lot. Like you, I covered a wide range of time there,
Right.
and there were different developments. But yeah, I went to great lengths to cite these things. And the thing is, here's the thing, Ambassador Battle. I could have written this without interviewing most of these people, without doing any research. But you know how it is. You don't want to prejudge what you're doing. I laid out a template of what I was going to look for, what questions I wanted to ask from the middle, and what I thought to be both sides of the argument. And then I went after them and I asked, and then depending on what the interviews did and what I read and research, you adjust, right? But in the end, my conclusions and what I wrote, honestly, are pretty much what I thought. And that's not being egotistical or biased or arrogant. I mean, it's just having lived it and been involved in it. Sometimes that's detrimental. You're too close to it. But I was at all levels. I was on the ground in Africa. I was in embassies. I was the African Union. I was in Stuttgart. I was the Pentagon. So I saw it from all different angles, and I think that gave me a unique perspective to help write this chapter. And so in the end,
it gave you an excellent perspective, and it is clear when a person reads your chapter that you were on the ground, that you were intimately involved with the formation process, that you knew what you were talking about, that you were not writing this from an abstract distance academic point of view only. You were writing it from a person who had academic capacity, who understood the need for documentation, and at the same time who had personal experience. Being a seminary president, dealing with people who are taking homiletics classes in preaching, we often say to people that if you preach a sermon, the people who hear that sermon have to genuinely know that you care and that you have some passionate connection with what you're talking about. Well, your homiletics and your hermeneutics were excellent in this chapter. You do an excellent job, and people can sense your personality as you write the chapter, and you will be exceedingly proud of your work when you see it. And when you read the other chapters as well, it will even make you more proud of your having put the perspective of AFRICOM from its origins, its genesis, in this book. So I think we did America a good job by writing these two chapters in the book.
Well, that's awesome. But now I feel wholly negligent. So the next time I have you on as a guest and we talk, whether it's about chaplaincy or it's about Africa or anything, because I'm going to invite you back. But the next time I'm going to have to have coughed up and stop being frugal, pay the $160, read the book so I can say complimentary things about your chapter, because I haven't had a chance to read it yet. And that's the thing I really look forward to. But thank you. That's very kind of you. Those are very kind words. Folks, you're listening to Chris White Africa on the Indaba Africa channel here on the Indaba Broadcasting Network. 4th of February, 2021. My special featured guest today is Ambassador Michael Battle, former ambassador to the U.S. Mission to the African Union. And we've run through the hour. I don't know. Can you stay a couple more minutes and maybe we can wrap up, or you got to take off?
Well, if we could wrap up in 5 minutes, I'll be good.
All right. Well, then what we're going to do is I'm going to turn it to you, sir, and I'm going to ask you if there's anything that you'd like to share, either from the book project experience, from U.S. Mission to the African Union, the U.S. African, anything, and thoughts about U.S. engagement in Africa, any of those topics you want to share with the audience, because we have people all over the world who have an interest in Africa who watch this program.
Okay. What I would like to do, first of all, is thank you both for the chapter that you wrote and also for having me as one of your guests on this show. What I'm hoping for as the African continent moves into the next 10, 15, 20 years, that there is a global engagement. The world needs Africa to develop as a continent. The natural resources, the human resources, the agricultural capacity of the African continent. You know, the United Nations has already predicted that in the next 20 to 30 years, 1 out of every 4 persons on planet Earth under the age of 35 will be an African. That means that 1/4 of the future of planet Earth is going to be African. So the world has to engage with Africa. We can no longer have a whole continent that is described at large as poor and as poverty stricken and as developing. The world needs Africa to develop. The world needs Africa to have an industrial revolution. The world needs Africa to be able to employ its people, to be able to feed its people, to be able to end poverty on its continent. And if that happens, the rest of the world will benefit. So I'm hoping that the US, that Russia, that China, that Israel, that South America, and everybody will get engaged with Africa as a partner to develop the African continent, because the globe needs it.
Well, that's well said, Ambassador Battle. Ambassador Michael Battle, thank you so much. It's been a distinct pleasure having you on. Thank you also for the very kind words you said about my chapter and my participation. I appreciate that. That's high praise, and I appreciate it very much. You are welcome back on the channel anytime in the future, and maybe I'll get together with you sometime soon. We'll try to get you up and talk about some of these other topics.
Well, thank you. Peace be with you, man.
All right, take care, Ambassador. All right, folks, that's Ambassador Michael Battle as he signs off there. Oh, that's pretty cool. I like that. It's critically important for youth to actively engage and define what they would like the world to like. That's pretty cool. Let me just go ahead and wrap up here very quickly, folks. Thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been a pleasure for me. I really enjoyed it. It was a long effort to get this book to publication. It's out there now. And it was a pleasure having Ambassador Battle on as my guest. I just wish I'd had a chance to work for him at the African Union or elsewhere in Africa. He's a pleasure to work with and a delight, a wonderful human being. So, folks, thanks for tuning in today. I'll be back with the Night Owls edition here in 2 hours and 25 minutes. 2 hours and 25 minutes, 27 minutes, and catch you guys here again for that. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget, my guest tomorrow is Helmut Ruma-Heitman, the premier defense and securities analyst in South Africa. He'll be joining me on the program tomorrow. Thanks a lot. Give the video a like, share it with your friends and your family, let them know about it and appreciate it. And anyway, folks, not asking people to rush out and buy the book. Neither of us have a financial interest in it. But if you are curious, the link to the book is located in the video below this. You can go check it out. There's a link there to one spot, also to Amazon if you want to go buy the thing, or you can get it from Walmart or somewhere like that. I don't know where you can get it in Africa, but that's certainly the case here in the U.S. But anyway, folks, thanks for tuning in, and God bless. And we will catch you here in a couple of hours on Chris Why in Africa. All right, that's it. I'm out of here, and take care, folks.